if I remember where we left off, you dropped this really provocative thought, and I have not been able to get it out of my head for the last several weeks. In fact, I was even writing about it today and was talking with my team about it, which is this idea that this is just a piece of what we were talking about, but this idea that I've just been dwelling on is the notion that the international peace and stability that we've enjoyed for a couple generations now. I mean, it hasn't been perfect. It's not like there has been no war, no violent conflict anywhere on the planet. But in relative terms, there's been no war between great powers. Certainly not between the superpowers. There hasn't been all-out war, and there's been a relatively small amount of violent conflict. And in general, judging by historical standards, pretty extraordinary peace and stability that's gone along with the prosperity of the global north. And your very provocative question or point was, is any of that really down to humanity's collective wisdom increasing and us becoming better people and improving our institutions and democracy spreading and all of the rest of that noble story that that narrative that we almost always tell ourselves? Or is it really just a matter of, we've enjoyed unprecedented economic growth and material prosperity, and that has just, kept the wolves from the door, basically? And that we may be deluding ourselves into thinking that these other social and institutional factors are where we've made progress, when in fact the real progress that mattered was just material prosperity and economic growth, and the economic growth being a proxy for other things like not just material prosperity, but maybe perhaps more subtle dimensions of value creation in general. So I have not been able to get that damn idea out of my head. This idea that humanity hasn't become necessarily better, and that it isn't, perhaps it isn't progress of the kind that we thought that has given us a peaceful and more stable world than our grandparents and great-grandparents and great-great-parents and so on enjoyed. And I think this is really quite profound. And if that's the case, if it's true, if this, even if it's only partially true, even if it's just a matter of those variables being much more important than they're giving credit for, but certainly if they tend to be, certainly if the situation is such that those tend to be the dominant variables, then there are enormous implications to that, looking ahead into the future. And one of the biggest ones, of course, would be that anything we do that curtails economic growth, anything that we do to curtail material prosperity, this would be just inviting absolute disaster, not just economic disaster, but like social, geopolitical disaster in terms of violent conflict, social unrest, war, and so that adds an enormously significant implication to the whole degrowth paradigm, the whole degrowth approach to achieving sustainability, environmental sustainability, for example, and everything that goes along with that entire ideology. So, this has been weighing on my mind a lot recently, and it's all, you just said it like it was almost like it was a passing thought, and it was really one of the more profound ideas I've encountered in the last few years. So anyway, I was hoping we could talk more about that and explore it and think about, just sort of unpack it and see if we can figure out whether we really think that that's true, how we would test it, and what the implications might be, and so forth. It's just an idea that struck me so hard that I want to explore it.
So I think I made a more circumscribed statement than what you just said. But can you repeat? I mean, so the I was maybe I'll set it up this way. So there's often a discussion in the economics literature about the degree to which democracy is a necessary condition for economic growth, right? Uh, this is controversial and fundamentally uninteresting, I think, clearly false given the experience of China and many other cases. So I don't know how this is even an interesting question, but it seems to be one that's often discussed. Uh, what I was doing was posing the question in the opposite direction, right? Is democracy, in some sense, is economic growth a necessary condition? Now, that's well, you could say it's just wrong because you could look at, say, Japan in the last decade has had very little economic growth per capita but remains a democracy. Quite different in some respects to the US or Australia, but still unarguably a democracy. Um, Economic growth per capita in France, I guess, has been fairly static as well. So, if you like, you could just say that no, the answer is no. You could have a democracy and not have economic growth, at least not per capita economic growth. Uh, so I'll come back to maybe formulating a version of my question more precisely. But you were not talking only about democracy, right? You were indicating something like the geopolitical stability and lack of war and so on. I agree with that as well. But maybe it would be worth spelling out exactly the scope of the question. So the phenomena that we're talking about as possibly being dependent, I mean, good things that we want to continue and that we've experienced in the last few decades, perhaps as a consequence of economic growth or perhaps not, but we wish them to continue. And what are those factors? So, I mean, I guess democracy is, something that people here probably appreciate. I'm not sure it's necessarily high on the agenda for a randomly selected Chinese person, for example, whereas economic growth certainly is. So, in the hierarchy of positive things in the universe, democracy isn't number one on everybody's list. But maybe let's make a list. So, apart from sort of geopolitical stability and lack of war, was there anything else you mentioned, Adam, just now?
I guess I was being pretty loose and sloppy, speaking around the general idea of social prosperity is I guess a catch-all term that I would use, and I suppose I would distinguish social prosperity from material prosperity, and this dichotomy is something that I encounter quite a lot in the environmental discourse, and I think that the distinction between material prosperity and other forms of prosperity, all other forms of prosperity, which I will just call social prosperity here, because we're talking about prosperity from an anthropocentric perspective. That dichotomy is at the center of the degrowth paradigm, the degrowth narrative. It's the idea that we can prosper as human beings without having material prosperity, or indeed we can prosper and in the one dimension, in the one sense, in some way, which I'm calling socially, while at the same time we can actually actively lose prosperity in a material sense. We can use less energy, we can use less materials, we can have the throughput of energy and material of our lives, the energy and material throughput in our individual lives, that could decrease, and it wouldn't necessarily affect these other forms of prosperity. And that's really the dichotomy that struck me. It struck me that is an assumption that is rooted in looking at the last, several generations of human history, and thinking that material prosperity just doesn't have all that much to do with other forms of progress we've made, other forms of social progress we've made. because the world today is more prosperous in both senses than it was in the past. It's materially more prosperous, but in all these other ways, we seem to have made progress towards social prosperity as well. Now, if it turns out that, well, anyway, I suppose what my question is, there seems to be an orthodoxy in assuming that these can be decoupled, or that the social prosperity is what gives rise to the other, that there's a causal arrow there, and that if you're socially prosperous, then it will give you material prosperity, or the material prosperity doesn't matter. And what I'm thinking now, again, inverting an assumption that I realize I had been making my entire adult life, which is maybe it's actually entirely the other way around. Maybe it is the material prosperity that alone, or at least in the bulk, in the majority, that has caused or made possible all of the social prosperity. And that idea, that is the opposite of what I realize I have been walking around assuming in my head for as long as I can remember now. And so I guess that's a much larger and more general framing. And maybe we can dive into specifics to see what we can make sense of there. But that was this, and again, that goes back to this formula that my organization uses, which Dan, you pointed out very well in our earlier sessions, which is to find underlying assumptions that we are making that may not be true, or perhaps that could change and be obviated in the future. And so this seemed like a very profound one to me.
Yeah, maybe I'll set out a couple of reasons why I made the observation. So I think there's two experiences that led me to think about this. One is being in the United States for 6 years and witnessing the increasing polarization and dysfunction of democracy there, and thinking about the reasons and the debates about the reasons that are going on all the time. And the other is just paying close attention to Chinese development since, let's say 1989 or wherever you want to pin the starting date. I think it's very interesting to pay attention to the way in which China developed, because some very smart, wise people were involved in that. I think it's tempting to dismiss it because many Westerners have a kind of ideological lens through which they perceive the history of China. But think about the following. Imagine China in 1980, 1989, very poor, many severe problems, right? So simply surviving was difficult for many millions of people. The severity of many of the problems faced by a government in China are beyond anything a rich country like Australia currently faces. Did they solve those problems one by sitting down with smart people and coming up with some clever solution to each one? No, they didn't solve almost any of those problems. What they did was have the insight that they didn't need to solve those problems. They would solve themselves if they had sufficient growth. And they really did a very good job on incentivizing local officials to focus on growth. Now, that had many downsides, right, which are the things that people in the West obsess about. So it produced a lot of pollution, misallocation of capital, etc., etc. So it was in many ways not optimal. But it's very difficult to propagate information and control through a complicated system on the scale of China, right? So they recognize that. That's a central feature of Chinese governance historically, that recognition. And they just sent this one message: grow, damn it, make yourself grow, and got local officials to go along with the script. And it worked. And whatever the side effects, China is undoubtedly a much more wealthy place, and the human well-being is much higher than it was in 1989. And what struck me reading that history is that it wasn't a history of 100 difficult local problems that were solved by smart officials doing something clever in each case. It was just a maniacal focus on growth, and then relying on growth to ameliorate all the other problems, because you can just buy off special interest groups. And that's a feature of American democracy in 2020 through 2022 that seems very important as well, right? So there will always be special interests that are vying to control politics, and we tend not to think about politics in our own countries very realistically because we have this model of democracy in our heads, whereas we should probably think more often about special interests of various kinds as being mostly in control. And if you're growing, the special interests are kind of distracted by trying to look into and capture as much of the new parts of the pie as they can, and they don't spend so much effort undermining, destroying, and rewriting the rules of the system. Whereas it seems to me that what's happening very much in the US, and maybe soon in Australia as well, is that if the special interests perceive that the system is remaining more or less fixed in terms of its, capacity for extracting rents, then people start to fight very fiercely over which parts of those rents they can capture for their own faction. And then you get very sharp fights and attempts to, people focus on changing the rules, whereas that's not the optimal strategy for becoming wealthy and preserving your status if the system is growing. If the system is growing, you should become good at whatever it is the growth is about. For example, you should become a railroad baron, or you should figure out how to get into tech or something. Right? Whereas if things are more or less static, that's not the optimal strategy. So I think a system like democracy, it seems that a system like that, which relies on a certain extent of goodwill and following the norms, is very vulnerable if the norms become the point at which you can apply pressure in order to win. Like that's the main place you can apply pressure, as opposed to taking advantage of new opportunities. That's just coming out of there's quite a long literature and a lot of discussion among some parts of the economist community about the lack of real growth since, the 1970s, 1980s. Certainly medium incomes have remained flat, and what that's meant for politics in terms of people fighting over a fixed or shrinking pie as opposed to trying to take advantage of new opportunities. So that's where that comment comes from.
Yeah, I think that makes really good sense. And I sort of see this logic making sense at both a top-down direction and from a bottom-up direction. What you've described just now was mostly, although you alluded to the very end of the bottom up, but what you described mostly when you're, at least my read of it, when you say special interests, is that you have these sort of consolidated centers of wealth and power and influence in the system, and that they can focus on, if they focus on the parts of the system that are growing, then this sort of allows the status quo to persist without major challenges. And I think you laid that out and made a very compelling argument for that. And at the same time, I should say, and I think also at the same time, right down at the bottom of the right down at the individual level, I think you have a similar sort of dynamic going on just with the human psychology of individuals, and maybe you can move up from there to individual organizations or communities or something like that. But certainly down at the level of the individual, I think that something similar is operative, which is that individual people historically, I think certainly in living memory, are less likely to violently oppose the status quo, or perhaps not even violently, but just aggressively oppose the status quo if the pie is growing. If everybody's getting a little bit bigger piece of the pie as time goes on, so next year you're going to do a little better than this year. If that's happening to everybody, then the inequities, the unfairness, the injustices, and so on in the system are perhaps more tolerable, just psychologically. Whereas if the pie is not growing, if the pie is static or shrinking, then an individual's own prosperity, an individual's own well-being may remain static or decline over time. And that, I think, just psychologically, it sets the ground for discontent, and then perhaps for things like populism of various stripes, across the political spectrum, and just social unrest and discontent to arise. And so it seems like that makes pretty good sense. And this, I'm not. It's not a literature I've read really at all. Certainly not since undergraduate days. But I have a sort of a sense, a distant memory of reading political economy and sociology works, and thinking sort of Weber and Durkheim, these sort of things from previous generations in social in the social sciences and the humanities, that talk about that sort of general idea, this rising tide lifts all boats kind of idea, this growing pie, and this, so forth, and sort of there's a sociology or a psychology at work there that allows the flaws of the system to be masked, to be covered up, or to be ignored, as long as you said, the new opportunities are being created and the people can focus on those. So anyway, I think that makes pretty good sense. So I guess the question to ask is, do we fully recognize what the implications of a deliberate and permanent economic downturn, degrowth, basically, what that would entail? Like, have we fully appreciated the risks of that as a prescription for the degrowth narrative itself calls it a prescription for sustainability. I'm not all that comfortable with that word. I think that's loaded, it's freighted, it's misleading. But it's at any rate a prescription for how to solve problems that we face today of various kinds, and not just environmental problems, but social ones as well. And it may be that this is just completely backwards. That this would be utterly catastrophic on many levels, including socially and psychologically. So anyway, yeah, I think it's a.
Well, it clearly doesn't.
That make sense?
It clearly can be sustainable. I mean, the old aristocracies were sustainable for hundreds or thousands of years. I mean, we can do it sustainably, but not in a way that's compatible with our other ethical obligations. So I think it seems pretty clear that what we're experiencing now, it seems to me, is a consequence of exactly attempting to not grow and see what happens, right? We didn't do it deliberately, but for various reasons. We are refraining from the commitment to growth, partly because in Australia and the US we've become quite wealthy, so we don't focus on this as much as we used to. But I think the effects on politics are pretty clear. I mean, of course, one can argue about many other causes, and they of course exist, but I think when I hear people talk about there's sustainable growth, but when people talk about just not growing or accepting much lower growth rates, I think it can be sustainable, but only if we change the structure of our societies. Maybe they remain in principle democratic, but I think you can see it already in the attempts to very finely control the ladders of moving between classes in the US. I know talking about class in the US is, maybe a bit offensive, but there clearly are classes in the US, and there clearly are mechanisms for transitioning between them, and those mechanisms are becoming very contentious, right? Who gets into university? Who gets to pass standard exams? What happens after you graduate from university? Who gets to go to what universities? These are questions that have become very central somehow politically, whereas they maybe weren't 10, 15 years ago. And I think this reflects a growing perception that, well, this is a question for you Americans, but I think in a way that probably wasn't true when we were kids, Adam, there's a sense now in America that there will be an aristocracy, and you're either in it or you're not, and you probably want to be in it.
This idea that there's a so I mentioned before this idea of social prosperity, and maybe we can just real quickly dig into what that would be, because you have psychological dimensions to that, things at the individual level that you could talk about, and then you have things at a larger or more macroscopic unit of analysis that you could talk about. So the idea of a large underclass, for example, versus what you called an aristocracy. This is sort of this would be an indicator of social prosperity, not necessarily at the individual level, but I mean, one could imagine that if you were to look at a society over time and see that its middle class was shrinking and its underclass was growing, that would be an indication of a decline in some sense, in some sort, in something that one would wish for, a form of prosperity that would seem to be declining. That there are fewer people are as well off, or, for example, children are less well off than their parents, or they're less likely to be upwardly mobile, or more likely to have fewer opportunities or backslide socially and economically than their parents did. And so those strike me as very important forms of social prosperity, and that seem to be coupled pretty tightly with material prosperity. I think it's really quite profound what you said, that and as an American, this is something that we're enculturated to not really think about too much. But this idea that who gets into university, and where, and which ones, and what jobs go to which graduates, and so forth, that these are more politicized now than they were in the past. I think that's absolutely the case.
I guess we'll have to. Have to wrap up in a few minutes, I guess. But there's, I wanted to make one comment, which is, I think maybe people don't sufficiently pay attention to the role of economic growth in resolving otherwise very difficult problems, because it reduces the agency of technocrats. I think this is an underestimated feature of why things are the way they are in the world, right? So people want there to be a lot to do managing things because they like the existence of those jobs. And if it's simply growth, then that moves the locus of power away from technocrats towards the kind of people who produce growth. Now, to be clear, that's not me, right? I'm in a university. I don't contribute much to economic growth beyond my activities as a lecturer. But the political power of the kinds of people who create businesses and create economic growth directly, as opposed to just managing the economic conditions that may cause it to arise, if those people don't have, if their power is outweighed by the sort of technocratic power, then you will tend to see a society which believes that there are all sorts of things you can do to solve problems that don't involve just bluntly exerting some sort of very indirect pressure to increase economic growth, which isn't sexy to the technocrats, at least many of them. And I think that's my potted version of history in the last 20 years, is the rise of the power of those kinds of people, as opposed to the kind who would just want to focus on simple growth. That's, obviously not a universally shared view, but I think one should be what I think the people who believe that many complicated problems can be solved by other means need to demonstrate historically where that's worked. If I look at many of the problems that we had, I mean, just reading the detailed history of Australia since 1788, and think about all the intractable social problems that were faced along the way, very few of them were resolved, really, right? It's just they went away. And they went away because the country overall got richer, not equally and not evenly, and in many ways unfairly. And many of the problems still persist, but I think it's fashionable to deride the role of economic growth in solving problems that don't look like they have anything to do with economic growth, simply because some people get richer than others. I think that's unfortunate that people don't, with caveats, accept that as a basic feature of what we've experienced since the Industrial Revolution. It seems like a myopic understanding of how we solved problems in the past and therefore how we might solve them in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And this idea that I mean, it gets us back to the real substance of this and this conversation and others like it, which is, how do we do better in the future? How do we continue to solve problems? How do we continue to make progress? Where should we be putting the emphasis? Where should we be spending the most time and energy and resources and focus of attention and all of that sort of thing? And does it make more sense to take a more technocratic approach and try to solve 101 different problems with different different strategies and tactics and does history bear out the idea that is the strategy that has worked, that we've sort of chipped away at many multiple different problems simultaneously, and we've just sort of cracked many of those nuts with an increasing collective wisdom. We've made we've made intellectual and moral and philosophical progress, and then we've slowly institutionalized that progress, and then we've solved problems that our ancestors just couldn't figure out how to solve. So and made life better for people. Is that really the story? Is that valid, or has it, like you sort of suggested with the history of Australia, I think as an example, that many of these problems perhaps have not been solved to the extent that we imagine they have, that they're sort of lurking in the background. They've simply been eroded down so that their edges are softer and their features are more blurry, and that erosion has been mostly, perhaps to an underappreciated extent, a function of economic growth, and that the hard corners of those problems come back into relief once the engine of economic growth starts to slow down a little bit. And it's this maybe mixing some metaphors here this in not a helpful way, but that does strike me as a central question to ask if we want to know how can we continue to make progress, and what progress have we made, and how have we made it? And it just strikes me as suspicious now that I challenge the conventional narrative and the orthodoxy about what has actually given rise to progress. And this doesn't mean I think there's justification for a big neoliberal swing to just shifting over into the camp that economic growth is the solution to everything. I'm certainly not arguing that, but I do wonder if the precondition of material prosperity and the economic growth that's delivered that is really is a necessary condition for the making the sorts of progress we imagine we have made and can continue to make, socially and otherwise. And now that I'm challenging that the narrative that I had in my head, I'm more increasingly skeptical that we can do that. And it also seems that runs very contrary to the established orthodoxy in all of the Western environmental discourse that I've been living and breathing for the last 15 years. And I'm just worried that we may have a fundamental assumption just completely wrong there. and that a massive backslide away from the progress we think we've permanently achieved through enlightenment is possible if we don't really realize how we got this far. If we don't really understand and appreciate how we got this far, which maybe was much more to do with economic growth and appreciate than that narrative appreciates. Yeah.
I guess we'll leave it there. Thanks a lot, Adam. That was interesting.
Well, thanks. I'm sorry this is a short session, but there's a lot to pick up on here. Maybe we can continue next time and elaborate in a few ways.
Yeah, sounds good. All right, thanks everyone. So we're going
Fantastic. Thank you, guys.
See ya. We'll move over to Discord for the MetaUni Dev session.